The three of them quit on the same morning. Not together, not by arrangement, but within 4 hours of each other. And none of them has ever gone back into a forest since. What they described wasn't dangerous. It wasn't violent. It was something that simply should not have been capable of learning that fast. Reginald Voss had spent 19 years with the National Park Service before he handed in his badge on September 14, 2019, at the Escalante Interagency Visitor Center in Escalante, Utah, at approximately 7:42 in the morning. He had started his career in 1999, at age 24, as a seasonal ranger at Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois, transferred to Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in 2007, and by the time he quit, he was a senior patrol ranger who had hiked every maintained and unmaintained trail in that monument. More than 1.9 million acres of canyon, mesa, and sandstone, more times than he had counted. He was not a superstitious man. He held a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Southern Illinois University. He had, over the course of his career, responded to 17 search and rescue operations, found 2 human remains, survived 1 flash flood, and treated more rattlesnake bites than the official incident log reflected, because he had handled several informally to avoid paperwork. He was, by every measure, someone who understood what the wilderness was and what it was not. He filed his resignation on a Sunday, which was unusual enough that the administrative assistant at the visitor center, a woman named Dolores Archulette, who had worked that desk for 11 years, later told investigators from the Park Service's Internal Safety Review Committee that she remembered the day with precise clarity. She said Reginald had come in holding his badge in both hands, laid it flat on the counter between them, and said, without any other preamble, "I'm not going back out there." He had not appeared frightened. He had appeared, she said, like a man who had finished a long calculation and arrived at an answer he did not want, but could not dispute. The incident that preceded his resignation had occurred 4 days earlier, on September 10th, along the Coyote Gulch trail system, specifically in the stretch between Hurricane Wash Trailhead and the confluence with Redwell Draw, at an elevation of approximately 5,280 feet. Reginald had been conducting a solo patrol, standard procedure for senior rangers in that area, beginning at 6:15 in the morning. The weather was clear. Temperature at departure was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. He had his radio, his GPS unit, 2 liters of water, an emergency bivouac kit, and a handheld voice recorder he used for dictating incident notes, a habit he had developed in his 3rd year on the job because he found it faster than writing. The voice recorder captured everything. The first 40 minutes of the recording are unremarkable. Reginald narrating trail conditions, noting a section of sandstone shelf near the Fence Canyon Junction that had eroded further since his last patrol 6 weeks prior, commenting on the absence of recent footprints in the sandy washbed, which suggested the trail had seen no visitors in at least 2 days. His voice is steady, professional, the cadence of a man reciting information he has recited hundreds of times. At the 43-minute mark, he pauses mid-sentence. He had been describing the moisture level of the soil near a seep on the canyon's north wall, and the recording captures what he would later describe in his written incident report as an echo that was slightly ahead of itself. He had said the word calcite, referring to a calcite deposit on the canyon wall, and before the final syllable had fully left his mouth, the word came back to him from somewhere ahead, in the canyon's throat. He stopped. He noted this on the recording. Echo off the east wall. Unusual timing. He continued walking. Rangers learn early to recognize the acoustical behavior of slot canyons and sandstone corridors. Echoes in those environments can behave in ways that surprise even experienced hikers, bouncing off curved walls and arriving at angles that make them seem to originate from impossible directions. Reginald had heard plenty of strange echoes. He filed this one and moved on. At the 51-minute mark, he stopped again. He had been talking continuously since the first anomaly, narrating his observations as he always did. At 51 minutes, mid-sentence, he stopped. The recording captures the silence. 11 seconds of it, which is a long silence when you are alone in a canyon and accustomed to filling silences with professional narration. Then his voice, quieter than before. It stopped when I stopped. The echo, or whatever it was, had been returning his words at that slightly off interval. Not an echo, exactly, because echoes do not sustain across variable sentence rhythms, but something that was mimicking the pattern of his speech, the approximate cadence of his narration, arriving just ahead of where an echo should arrive. He had walked another quarter-mile without fully registering it, and then he had stopped mid-sentence, and it had stopped. And in the 11 seconds of silence before he spoke again, there was nothing. No ambient canyon sound, no wind, no settling of rock. The silence itself was wrong, in a way he couldn't articulate in the moment. In his incident report, written 3 days later, he described it as the silence of a room in which someone has just stopped breathing, rather than a room that has always been empty. He turned around. The canyon behind him was empty. Red sandstone walls, the narrow ribbon of pale sky above, the shadow stripe running down the western face, exactly as it should be. He stood looking at it for a long moment. Then he turned back around and continued walking. He did not speak for the next 7 minutes. The recording captures his footsteps in the sandy wash, the occasional scrape of a boot against rock, his breathing, which is measurably faster than it had been in the recording's first 40 minutes. At the 58th minute, he says, very quietly, a single word. Hello. The silence that follows lasts 3 seconds. Then, hello. From somewhere ahead of him, and slightly above. From a place in the canyon where there was no overhang, no alcove, no surface that should have produced a reflection of that quality. The voice is his. Indisputably his. Reginald Voss's specific vocal timbre, the flat Southern Illinois vowels that 19 years in Utah had not entirely erased, but the interval is wrong. A genuine echo in that canyon, at that distance from the east wall, would have returned in approximately 1.2 seconds. This came back in 3. Something had waited before answering. In his incident report, Reginald wrote that he stood in that spot for what he estimated to be 2 minutes, though the recording indicates it was closer to 4.5. He did not speak again. He did not move. The recording captures his breathing, slower now, which is not the pattern of a man whose fear is escalating, but the pattern of a man who is making himself breathe slowly, deliberately, because he has understood something, and he is controlling his response to it. He wrote in the report, I had the distinct impression that whatever was producing the sound was doing the same thing I was doing. Waiting. Listening. Matching my stillness with its own. He turned around and walked back to the Hurricane Wash trailhead at a pace the GPS unit later recorded as consistent and unhurried. He did not run. He said afterward that he had not wanted to run. He could not explain why. He drove back to the visitor center in Escalante, sat in his truck in the parking lot for approximately 40 minutes, and then went inside and wrote his incident report. He did not file it. He slept, poorly, for 2 nights, and on the morning of September 14th, he drove back to the visitor center and laid his badge on Dolores Archuleti's desk. When the Internal Safety Review Committee asked him what he believed he had encountered, he said, I don't know what it was. I know what it was doing. It was learning how I talked, and it had been doing it for a while before I noticed. He has not returned to Grand Staircase Escalante. He has not, to anyone's knowledge, returned to any National Park Service land. He lives now in Carbondale, Illinois, where he works as an electrician. He does not discuss the incident except in the formal record of the safety review, and when journalists or researchers have contacted him, he has declined to speak on the record. One researcher, a folklorist named Prentice Oman from the University of Utah, managed to reach him by phone in March of 2021, and Reginald spoke to him for 9 minutes before ending the call. The only portion of that conversation Oman has shared publicly is a single sentence, which he included in a paper on anomalous auditory phenomena in canyon environments published in the Western Folklore Journal. Reginald said, "The thing that bothers me most, when I think about it now, is that it had already been following me for a long time before I heard it. It just hadn't made a mistake yet." Yolanda Tressiter had worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 11 years when she quit on the morning of September 14th, 2019. She was stationed at the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, specifically the Mirror Lake Ranger District, which encompasses a portion of the high Uintas wilderness in northeastern Utah. a wilderness area of approximately 460,000 acres, among the highest roadless terrain in the contiguous United States, with elevations reaching above 13,000 feet. Yolanda was 36 years old, a graduate of Utah State University with a degree in wildlife biology. Before joining the Forest Service, she had spent 2 years as a field technician for a bird banding program in the Chiricahua Mountains of southeastern Arizona. She had been comfortable alone in remote terrain since the age of 17, when she had completed a solo backpacking route through Colorado's Weminuche Wilderness over the course of 9 days. She was, like Reginald Voss, someone whose relationship with wild places was professional, long established, and unsentimental. Her incident had occurred on September 7, 2019, 7 days before her resignation, during a routine backcountry patrol on the trail between Atwood Lake and Kidney Lakes at approximately 10,900 feet elevation. She had been monitoring wildlife corridor usage in the area, a project she had been running for 3 years, involving remote cameras, scat collection, and periodic visual surveys. And the September 7th patrol was the 4th of 5 scheduled surveys for that field season. She knew that terrain intimately. She had walked that specific trail segment, between the outlet of Atwood Lake and the rocky ridge above Kidney Lakes, no fewer than 40 times over the preceding 3 years. At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, she stopped on the ridge above the upper Kidney Lake to take bearing notes and eat a protein bar. The weather had been clear all morning, but cloud buildup over the Kings Peak Massif to the south suggested afternoon thunderstorms were possible, and she was noting this in her field book when she became aware that the birds had stopped. This requires some contextual explanation. At 10,900 feet in the high Uintas in early September, the bird community is thin but consistent. Rosy finches working the talus, Clark's nutcrackers moving through the whitebark pines on the lower slopes, the occasional red-tailed hawk on thermals. Yolanda had, over her years of work in that area, internalized the baseline acoustic texture of that ridge, the way a musician internalizes the particular resonance of a familiar concert hall. She noticed the absence before she consciously registered that she was noticing it. Her pen stopped moving in her field book, and she sat listening, and there were no birds. Not unusual in itself. Birds go quiet before weather, before a predator's approach, before any number of ordinary stimuli. But there was something else. An odor. She described it in her incident notes, which she filed with her resignation, 3 pages of them, handwritten on Forest Service field paper, as the smell of a place that has been enclosed for a long time and then opened. A mineral closeness, like the interior of a sealed cave encountered on a warm afternoon. She had smelled cave environments before, during a volunteer survey project at Timpanogos Cave National Monument in 2013. The smell on that ridge, in open air, at nearly 11,000 feet, above treeline, with a light wind from the southwest, was wrong in a way she found physically unpleasant before she could identify why. She put her field book in her pack and stood up. She scanned the ridge, talus field to the north and east, the wind-flagged whitebark pines at the ridge's western edge, beginning their descent toward the lake basin, the gray-green lichen-covered boulders, everything in its correct position, everything familiar. She had stood in that exact spot in April, in June, in early August. She knew the shape of the boulders to the north as well as she knew the layout of her apartment in Mountain Home, Utah. One of the boulders was different. Not different in a dramatic way, not moved, not cracked, not overturned. Different in proportion, slightly taller, slightly narrower in its upper third than she remembered it, and darker, though the sky was the same as when she had sat down and the light had not shifted. She stood looking at it for a long time. Her field notes record, 2:22 p.m., possibly disoriented, rechecked bearing against GPS, confirmed position. North boulder grouping appears inconsistent with prior survey imagery. Will photograph. She photographed it. The photographs, when reviewed later by the safety committee, showed a boulder entirely consistent with the survey photographs from her 3 prior visits in that field season. Whatever she had seen, whatever quality of the boulder had seemed wrong to her, standing there on that ridge, did not appear in the photographs. She continued her survey. She reached the upper Kidney Lake outlet at 3:05 p.m. She noted in her field book that the smell had followed her from the ridge, not continuously, but in patches, appearing and disappearing with no relationship to wind direction she could discern. At the outlet, she stopped again, and she noticed that the sound of water moving over the outlet rocks was slightly off. She stood listening to it for a long time. She was a wildlife biologist. She had been listening to water in wild places for her entire adult life. The sound of water moving over rocks in a particular configuration is, like most sounds in nature, highly consistent. The same rocks, the same volume of water, the same angle of current, produces the same sound. What she heard at the Upper Kidney Lake outlet on September 7, 2019, was almost exactly right. The rhythm of it was almost exactly what she knew. But there was a repetition in it, a small loop, a phrase within the sound that cycled slightly too regularly, slightly too precisely, in a way that running water does not. Running water is not precisely repetitive. Whatever she was hearing was. She left the trail. She walked around the long way, through the talus field east of the lake, back to the main trail below the Lower Kidney Lake, and descended to the trailhead at Mirror Lake without returning to the outlet. She drove back to the ranger station at Camas in silence, and she sat in the Forest Service truck in the parking lot until the lot lights came on at dusk. The following morning, she called her district supervisor and told him she needed a few personal days. She used those days to arrange her resignation paperwork and clear her field equipment from the storage room at the station. On September 14th, she signed the forms and left. The smell, she has told the one person she trusts to speak about this, a former colleague named Desiree Holquist, now a wildlife ecologist with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, was not what frightened her most. What frightened her most was the quality of the repetition in the water sound, because it was not mechanical. It was not the repetition of a machine or a recording. It was the repetition of something that had learned to produce the sound by listening to the sound, and had learned it well enough to reproduce it almost perfectly, but had reproduced it just slightly too perfectly, with just slightly too much regularity, in the way that a person who has memorized a piece of music they cannot quite feel plays it with metronomic accuracy where there should be human variance. It had learned the sound, Yolanda told Desiree, but it hadn't learned the randomness inside the sound. And I think it had only just started learning the water. I think it had been learning me for longer. Marcus Fleeg was the youngest, 7 years with the Park Service, assigned to Olympic National Park's Hoh River Corridor in Washington State, 31 years old in the fall of 2019. His incident came on September 11, 2019, at mile 8.2 of the Upper Hoh River Trail, at a permit site on a forested bench above the river that he had visited no fewer than 50 times over 4 years. Old-growth Sitka spruce with 12-foot diameters at the base, canopies lost in the Hoh overcast, roots massive and tangled under Isothecium stoloniferum, which he could identify by sight at 40 yards. He had inspected the site, found it in order, and was eating breakfast with his back to the river when he became aware that something at the edge of the spruce stand, approximately 20 feet ahead, was slightly wrong. Not moving, not making sound, not visible as a form distinct from the trees and the root masses and the undergrowth. Just a wrongness of proportion, of the way light fell across a space where light had always fallen in a way he had always registered without consciously registering it, because it had always been correct. He had been sitting there for 4 minutes before it crossed his threshold of conscious notice. He checked his watch afterward to confirm. 4 minutes in which something had been watching him while he ate. He wrote in his incident report, "The change was not in any element I can specify, not in color, not in form, not in position of known objects, but was rather a quality of presence that I registered as distinctly biological, distinctly aware, and distinctly focused on me." He did not run. He stood, took 2 steps back, then 3 more, then turned and walked all 8.2 miles to his truck at a measured, even pace. He has described this as the most difficult physical act of his life. He understood, with a clarity he cannot account for, that running would change something, that his controlled exit was part of a negotiation he did not understand, but could not afford to lose. He drove to the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center and resigned that afternoon. He was out of his apartment in Forks, Washington within the week. He now lives in Portland. He works in a warehouse. He does not go outside more than he must. The journalist who interviewed him, a reporter named Karina Beck from the Seattle Weekly, chose not to publish the piece. She has explained this decision once, at a press ethics panel in 2022. He wasn't afraid of the thing itself. He was afraid of what it meant that it had been there, watching him, for 4 years of patrols, and he had never noticed. He was afraid of what it had learned, and he was afraid of whether noticing it was what finally taught it something new. The Park Service Internal Safety Review Committee, in its final report of January 2020, attributed all 3 incidents to known psychological phenomena: acoustic pareidolia, hypervigilance fatigue, pattern recognition distortion in high-autonomy solo environments, and recommended enhanced wellness protocols. No investigative follow-up was recommended at any of the 3 sites. On January 22, 2020, a solo hiker named Fenwick Oduya filed a written report at the Olympic National Park Visitor Center. He had visited the 8.2-mile bench site on the Ho River Trail. He had heard his own voice, from inside the old-growth stand, repeating something he had said aloud on the trail 3 minutes prior. He had encountered no other hikers. His report was logged and filed without cross-reference to the September 2019 materials. It is 6 sentences long. The last sentence reads, "I want to note that it didn't say it back wrong. It said it back right. That's why I'm writing this down." Whatever was learning in those places in the fall of 2019 has had more than 6 years now to keep practicing. It has never attacked anyone. It has never revealed itself. It has only ever listened and waited and gotten better. If this account left something open in your mind that you cannot close, that feeling means it worked. Like and subscribe. We find more of these every week.